60 knots.
Check.
V1, rotate.
Are the mics on?
The mics are on. Welcome to episode 14 of the Blue Skies podcast. Today we're joined by David Rohrer, President and CEO of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, a lifelong aviator dedicated to preserving Canada's flying history. Dave, welcome to the podcast. We're excited to learn more about your journey. And why don't we start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what initially drew you to aviation?
I'm really happy to be here tonight and to speak with you and learn also about the Northern Lights Aero Foundation. I started as a young lad in Windsor, Ontario, where I was born. I was attracted to speed, whether that was in a car or a motorcycle or anything or a boat. Speed was something I was interested in, and machinery I was interested in. And going to school, and I was the youngest of three boys at that time, and my dad was hoping that I would join the military and follow his footsteps. He had served during World War II. Although at the time, he thought maybe the Navy would be the choice. When I was on a naval training exercise, I happened to see Comox, or the Royal Canadian Air Force Base at Comox, and I realized there's a better way. And so when I came back and started university, I applied for ROTP, a civilian university, and went to the University of Windsor and started basic training through the Royal Canadian Air Force. But at that time, it was called the air element of the D&D because we had air, sea, and air elements, or air and sea and land. But it was the Royal Canadian Air Force as it's known today. And so I went to university with them, and I did my training in the summers, did my basic training in Portsmouth Prairie in 73 and 74. Then went back, finished my fourth year in university, and then to high-altitude indoctrination training, then to Canadian Forces Base Moose Jaw, where number 2 Canadian Forces Flying Training School, tutors, and got my wings on tutors in June of 1975. From there, I went to tactical helicopter in 427 Squadron at Petawawa, did an operational tour there, flew security in the 1976 Olympics in Montreal, which was quite interesting. After that, went back to tutors to instruct, and then followed after that to 403 Squadron in Gagetown to instruct in tactical aviation again. Got promoted to major, went to 10 Tactical Air Group. We had 11 helicopter squadrons and 2 fighter squadrons, and I was the group flight safety officer there prior to joining the reserves and coming over to the, as it was known then, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board. So I did 11 years of accident investigation with the Aviation Safety Board, which became the Transportation Safety Board and Accident Investigation Safety Board. Then I went back to Transport Canada and became the Regional Director of Aircraft Services, where we trained all the Transport Canada pilots. We were based in Toronto, but they moved to Hamilton, built a new hangar in Hamilton. So I was there for 8 years. We had 2 citations, 2 King Air C-90s, Bell 206 helicopter, and an Amphib 206, Cessna 206. In those days, we had about 60 pilots because we trained the Transport Canada pilots, aviation inspectors, both in jet and turboprop, depending on what their assignments were. But the safety board also had ATPL pilots that had contract training with us. And NAV Canada in those days had pilots, and we trained them as well. That was a really good job. We flew on our fleet about 2,200 hours a year out of Hamilton. And then I retired from all that in 2005, November 2005. And then went to corporate flying, flew Global Express for 8 years all over the world, and then got involved in the museum as a volunteer chief pilot, and still corporate fly today on other airplanes, and eventually became CEO and president of the Warplane Heritage Museum in 2005, November 2005.
Wow.
So,
what an extensive career.
Yeah, I've been very privileged and blessed to have the opportunities I've had.
Yeah.
Even today, to fly, get in a Citation Sovereign 680 Plus with Gremlin 5000 rides, and then hop in a B-25 with no Avion. See, it's a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome.
Diversity of the exposure I've been able to have.
What degree did you get while you were in university?
Well, it was I got a degree in economics because at the time when I started university, I was already accepted, and I hadn't been accepted for ROTP yet. So I wasn't sure if I was going to be in the Air Force or not. And then as I started, I was. But at that time, you could choose whatever discipline you wanted to go into. And I thought, well, if I was going to not be in the Air Force and go into business or perhaps into teaching, economics would be a good discipline to understand.
I see. That's true. Can help you in a lot of different parts in your life.
Yeah. Well, your wife is in the room with us today.
Yeah, my wife Sally.
Yeah. So how about you let us know where she kind of came into this story? And the reason why I asked is because with a lot of people that join us on our podcast, one question we like to ask is throughout such an extensive career, for a lot of our young listeners out there, one big hesitation is the social aspect and the personal aspect that comes with aviation. It's very demanding when it comes to your time, and some people that are looking to start a family might, negate them from joining such a career. So how did that work with you, especially through a militaristic viewpoint of aviation?
That's a great question. Well, first I'd like to say that I couldn't have done half of what I've been able to do without the support of my wife, Sally. She was the homemaker, and because of the travel and the nature of the business, it was interesting. I was already in third year university when we met, and Sally was a graduate nurse from Hotel Dieu in Windsor. And when we met and we decided that we wanted to share life together, we actually were married before I started fourth year university, and we lived in the married students' residence. And the reason we did that was because no one in Sally's family knew anything about the Air Force or about where I was going to take her. And you're going to Moose Jaw? But it worked out really well for us because when Sally graduated, she wrote exams and was the first year of writing exams that were across Canada exams. So when we went to different provinces, she could work in the hospitals on a part-time basis wherever we were, whether it was Saskatchewan or Manitoba or Quebec or New Brunswick. So it worked out really well. And she ended up being a very experienced, long-time experienced operating room nurse. And she got her first exposure to being an operating room nurse when we were in New Brunswick at Oromocto at CFP. Obviously, there is a larger responsibility, I think, on the spouses sometimes because of the demands that military life do put on you, especially in aviation. And there were times when in a year I would be on the road 190 days a year, and I couldn't do that. We couldn't raise a family. We couldn't do that without the anchor in the home, and Sally was that in every way. I think that is something that you do have to think about, but knowing a lot of people in the military, not only in the Air Force, but in the Navy is another place where you can be away for a long period of time. In land forces, the spouses are a very important part of the success of all the soldiers, airmen, and seamen and that we have.
Well, staying on that thought, the mental aspect of military training is also very intensive. Can you talk us through how you stayed mentally fit through such a rigorous, career through the military? It obviously mustn't have been easy at times. And how did you stay connected to not giving up?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be demanding. It can be challenging. But if it's your passion, and the thing that was a real positive in my development was being a member of a team and realizing in basic training, the whole aspect of basic training was to impress upon you that your success didn't count as much as the team's success. And so that if you lend support to that and help support the team succeeding, a perfect case in point would be taking a course through an obstacle course. And you would have different people who were fit and some people who were not as fit. And some of the obstacles would be much more difficult for some than others. You could be a person who could go through the obstacle course like a rabbit and be the first one through in your element. But that wasn't success. What was success was getting the person who was going to have the hardest time to go through those obstacles, to get them through and to come through together. And when you learned that really teamwork was what it was all about. Teamwork was the element of success that was most important was to be a team member, and the team success was more important than any individual success. And so when you realized that and you had that attitude and all the challenges that you went through, whether it was in the basic training or whether it was through pilot training or on a squadron, your first squadron, you realize that you're a part of the unit, an important part, but you are not the only part. And when you realize that you had to work, you won as a team and you succeeded as a team. Once you do that and you understood that, and then you could enjoy in the success of everybody. And when you were challenged and the team was challenged, and sometimes what you thought was going to work didn't work, then you could sit down and you could review it as a team and say, what went wrong? How do we fix that? What do we do differently? And when you'd come up with, we're going to do this, and when it succeeded, it just made your whole squadron stronger and better as a unit. That's what was really important. And when you go through basic training, they start right with that premise that you're going to do a lot of difficult things, physical and mental, but if you help each other through, you're all going to succeed.
And I think that's such a powerful message, not only for the military aspect, for commercial operations as well. For some of our listeners that are not familiar with what basic training might be, this message is powerful because it goes into the flight deck for commercial operations. It's not just an individual who's a pilot. You're working with, a team of 2, with your flight attendants, with your gate managers. So it's all a big team to keep the party going.
In aviation, the pilot is a member of a team, and whether it's the people who support and maintain the airplane or support the operation or do the loading of the airplane or the handling of the airplane, de-icing of the airplane, the flight planning of of the operation, you all have to work together and depend on each other, and everybody's contribution is important. And, pilots, particularly when cockpit resource management started through accident investigation, it quickly changed to crew resource management because it wasn't just the cockpit. It was all the people in the cabin. It was a bursar, all your flight attendants and personnel. And then it became crew resource management because the communication between the front and the back was extremely important. And that came out of, unfortunately, mishaps where all of a sudden we had this concept of cockpit resource management where the pilots, what was the communication like? Were there gradients in the cockpit? And then all of a sudden we said, well, wait a minute, there's a crew here. It's not just pilots. And that was a great plus in developing better strategies.
Did you struggle much through your training, or did you kind of fly through it?
Yes, I did. My wife was a great helpmate to me. When I started jet training, the school at Moose Jaw, number 2 Canadian Forces Flying Training School, before you went solo, and normally you were to go solo in between about 7 and 10 hours, depending on weather and progress. But you were only supposed to have one instructor until you went solo. And when I started, I didn't really know what was right or what was wrong. I had several different instructors in that time frame. And each instructor has different ways of teaching sometimes, and it did not benefit me. When it came time to go solo, I wasn't ready. And, there's a business decision to be made. The Air Force looks at early on in the progress, if it's questionable whether you're going to make the program, they would rather cut you now before they invest a lot of dollars in you and you don't make the program. So I ended up finding myself in what we call a board review, which was a progress review where you could be terminated. And there was a gentleman, and I hope someday you might be able to talk to him. His name was Bob Wade, Captain Bob Wade, and he works at the museum in Calgary, the Air Force Museum in Calgary. But at that time, he was on a snowbird. He had been a snowbird when the snowbirds were basically in their first 2 or 3 years of flying. And he had finished his team tour on the snowbirds, and he was waiting to go to 104s in Cold Lake. And so they made him chairman of this board. When I went through the board, and my academics were strong, I just written 100% in aerodynamics exams. And the other thing they looked at was officer development, your deportment, your dress, your presentation. And that was very strong. So my academics were good. My OD was good, but my flying wasn't where it should be. And so he went out through all those things, and then he made sure that we went through all the different changes in instructors that I had. And the determination of the board was that I had given the school 100%, but the school hadn't given me 100%. And so I was taken out of the flight and given a new instructor a new flight and 2 hours to get solo on. And I did and never looked back.
Wow.
So having sound judgment and sound review, because at that time I didn't know I was not being given the same opportunity that I should have been given. And Bob Way went on to be, when we bought our first F-18s, when we got our first F-18s in 1982, he was the first demonstration pilot.
Wow.
And he created the Alpha Pass. And just a wonderful guy. And I called him a year or so ago, and I said, Bob, you probably don't remember me. I just want to say thank you. And he was quite touched by that. He didn't remember him, but he was quite touched that I had thought to thank him.
How did you get in touch with him out just a year ago?
Well, because of the museum business.
Okay.
I'd heard his name, and I knew he was involved in the museum in Calgary. So I tracked him down. I just want to say thank you. And one of the things he said to me, and one of the questions he said in the board, as I said, I like speed, so I had a Corvette. And there was 3 members on the board, and one of his first questions was, what kind of car do you drive? And he knew I drove a Corvette. So, and it was pretty intense because you're looking at your career, you're looking at your dream, and it might not be there. Yeah. And so through that, and we were married, and in our course, there was only 2 fellows that went through the course married, and I was one of them. And it was always a plus for me because when I came home at night, I didn't have to worry about dinner being prepared, and I could study for 3 or 4 hours at night. And so Sally helped me quite a bit. In fact, she knew the checklist better than I did.
I was going to say, did you have like a co-pilot with you?
Oh, yeah. All the memory items and the big pages on a checklist. She knew engine failure, engine flame out drills as much as I did.
Oh, that's awesome. Why don't you speak a little more towards the moving around being in the military? You mentioned Moose Jaw, New Brunswick. You were in Hamilton for a bit with your other job. What was that like, just getting up and moving?
Now, we moved to Ancaster in 1999, and that was our 19th move.
Oh, my gosh.
But it was exciting. I always thought, we were young and starting a family, and it was exciting. When we went to Moose Jaw, and I'm a Southwest Ontario kid, so was Sally. Like, what are these electrical plugs in the front of these cars for? And if you didn't plug it in, it wouldn't start, right? And when I remember on the radio and the, public service award announcements, they would say, when you're driving in the winter, you should have blankets and food and a candle in your car. And I thought, what? Well, then we saw the mid-continent winter, and then I realized what they were talking about, because there were no cell phones at that time or anything. But it was, we had a lot of great experiences. Did the mountain flying course in Penticton for 6 weeks. And when I was there, some of the guys didn't want to do the early morning training. And so I said, I'll do all the early morning trips. If the second trip, and Sally was with me, we lived in a Penticton hotel, and they had ski racks on the cross tubes of the helicopters. And so it was winter time, and so Sally would meet me as I finished the first trip, and then with the skis, and we'd strap our skis in the second trip. And we had to go up the mountain, so they'd drop us off at the ski hill. And so we skied.
Get a free trip out of it. Oh, that's awesome.
It was very close family. And, we were in Montreal. That was a great tour.
Yeah.
And New Brunswick, we had a lot of fun. We toured all through the East and Maritimes, and, our parents came and visited us. And so the travel was exciting. It was great to see a lot of Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
And when you started having a family together, did you still move around after that, or did you stay in one spot?
No, we moved.
You moved even after.
Our first daughter was born. She was born in Moose Jaw, and shortly after we left Moose Jaw, and we were in St. Hubert, just outside Montreal, and she started maternal, became fluently bilingual because she could speak with no accent in either language. So that was a real plus.
Base life was important.
Yeah, base life was very important. Yeah, it was a society,
I see.
A close-knit society. Yeah, I enjoyed it. And, of course, in Montreal, all our friends would come visit us because they wanted to see old Montreal. And I was in Europe for NATO conferences at Rohrer and Baden. And in those days, we called them the 707s, out of Trenton that used to fly twice a week to Europe when we had our 2 bases there.
Wow.
And you could fly over and spend a couple of days in priority 5. So Sally could come with me on a priority 5 space available basis. And her brother was playing professional hockey in Munich. So the travel was just a way of life for us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I wanted to talk a little more about your role with the Transportation Safety Board and being a regional director of aircraft services there. What were your first initial years like with them? Was it very different from your officer roles, being in the military for most of your career and now going into this very different aspect, or was it pretty similar?
It was similar in some ways. When I was promoted and I was appointed as the group flight safety officer for 10 Tactical Air Group, where we had the helicopter squadrons and the F-5 squadrons. I went through basic training, academic training, aircraft accident investigation, helicopter accident investigation, human factors labs, and crew cockpit resource management. And we did this at the University of Southern California and worked with the United States Air Force Accident Investigation Lab at Norton Air Force Base in California. And that was a very sought-after program to be part of. And so I started with the military. And when I left the military and went to the safety board, they were doing the same thing. So I finished my certificate training with the safety board. And the reason I joined the safety board was because by that time I was considering that, a family life, that maybe we should try to settle down a bit. And they had only been formed in 1984, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board, and they were looking for people with a safety background. And so for crew flight safety officers, we were attractive in terms of joining that organization. I thought, I can join the reserve. I can transfer to the reserve and still have a military affiliation and role and do civilian accident investigation. And a lot of the people, because of the background of the Air Force in safety, a lot of the people who were in that original cadre with the safety board were ex-Air Force people. And I worked for Tom Hinton. He was the director of investigation, and he had been a centenaire, a golden centenaire in 1967 on Tudors, which was a forerunner of the Snowbirds. It was a very challenging role. In those days, the budget of the safety board was about $19 million for the national budget. And overall, there were about 600 accidents a year in Canada in all phases of aviation. And Ontario was busy. And so I ended up being involved on a number of regional accidents and then also doing some international work. They were under the ICAO Convention, Annex 44. If an occurrence happened in a country and the country didn't have the ability to conduct an investigation, they would come back to ICAO and ask for assistance. And ICAO, being headquartered in Montreal, would quite often go to the Aviation Safety Board in Ottawa and ask for assistance. So I ended up in Sierra Leone on an accident for a month, which was a high-profile accident. Then I ended up on the Dryden Commission. Actually, of course, the Aero Air accident that happened in Gander, that report came out in December of 85, the final report. And then in March of 89, we had the accident in Dryden with Air Ontario, F-28. And because the people who had been involved on the Aero Air accident, the organization said anybody that's been involved in that, and because it was a very contentious situation, because there was even friction on the board and a power struggle in some ways on the board, they came out and said anybody involved in the Aero Air accident will not be involved in the F-28 accident. And going back at that time, also there was some ill will, I think is the best way to put it, because Transport Canada, who used to do all the accident investigation, was not terribly pleased that now there was a new independent investigative body of the federal government, and it came out of the Dublin Commission, which was correct because Transport Canada could be in a conflict of interest if their regulations or their lack of oversight or contributed to an accident. So having a system like the NTSB in the United States made a lot of sense. One of the factors that came out in the Aero Air accident was contamination, and that was not well accepted for a number of reasons. And so now on March 10th of 1989, now we have an F-28 taking off out of Dryden in a heavy snowstorm. And although there's other factors that are involved, contamination is certainly one that has to be examined. And so that's when the safety board said, we want a totally new team. And so I ended up being the operations group chairman on that team. And because it was an operations accident, then a lot of that fell into my responsibility and area of responsibility. And it was a very daunting situation. I'd been on the road for about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks. And I was coming back to Air Ontario and London and to go through all the company corporate structure and the operation aspects and control, command and control, operational control, training. And I was sitting down to do an interview with Bill DeLuce, who was the president of Air Ontario at the time. And as I walked in, and I had the act in front of me, and we were allowed to record because it was part of the authority within our act. So he was flanked by several lawyers, and I explained our mandate and the authority that I would record this taping. And at which point he asked me, his lawyer asked me, Mr. Rohrer, do you have the authority to conduct this investigation? And at that point, a door opened and a TV was rolled in. And there's the Minister of Transport, Benoit Bouchard, standing down the Canadian Aviation Safety Board investigation and calling for a Royal Commission of Inquiry.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing about that was the Minister of Transport didn't have the authority to do that. But it was something that was obviously already agreed to. And so we went home, and I called Tom Hent, my director, and I said, Tom, what do we do? And he said, well, come home. So we went back, and within a couple of days, I got Judge Moshansky was appointed as the commissioner. Fred Von Vey was the chief commission counsel. And I got a phone call and said, we want you to come to Ottawa to meet the commissioner and the chief counsel. And so we met, and they said, okay, we want you as the ops group chairman. We want the IIC, who was an ex-Air Force guy by the name of Joe Jackson. And we want the human factors chairman, who was a Australian from their safety board, on exchange with us. You three are seconded to the commission. You have 6 months. We want your factual report on July. And it wasn't 6 months. We want your factual report on July. We don't want any analysis. We don't want any recommendations. We want only fact. So we went out and did the investigation and wrote a report like that, just factual, and submitted it. Probably 2 or 3 days later, I got a call that we were now seconded to the commission. And then I stayed on with the commission until we did 192 recommendations. Mostly all were accepted by Transport Canada. It was the real growth in the industry about contamination and how to treat contamination. In those days, we didn't have type 2 fluids. We didn't have type 3 or type 4 fluids. We only had type 1 fluids. And the Air Florida accident, for example, in 1982, that 737 out of Reagan that went into the 14th Street Bridge. In those days, the type 1 fluids were glycol water, and glycol heated to 190 degrees. But in that particular accident, they were cutting that fluid. Yeah, the company that was providing fluid to make more money, they were cutting more. It was more water and less glycol. So we really didn't know a lot about the vagaries of contamination. But through that commission, and that was a tremendous positive for the industry. And then type 2 fluids, anti-ice fluids came up on, and then type 3 and type 4. And now today, every year there's new tables put out of how long each fluid will last in whatever kind of climatic condition you have. And now their holdover tables are all there. None of that was there at that time, but it all came out of that Dryden Commission.
Would you say the Dryden accidents were kind of the biggest of your career with the Transport Safety Board?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, it seems very high impact, and it made a lot of downstream effects in aviation overall.
One of the questions was, when you're dealing with death and destruction, and you are often when an accident happens, in the Air Force, there was the flight safety badge was a top view of a fighter airplane, and half of it was white and half of it was black. And the reason that was because when you're in the midst of a crash site with death and destruction, that's the black side of aviation safety. But you're there to learn what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again. And that's the white side.
Yeah.
And that keeps you in a positive frame of mind and gives you positive motivation when you're in a very difficult situation, or you're talking to a wife that doesn't have a husband anymore, or a husband doesn't have a wife anymore, or children that don't have parents anymore. That can be very taxing. But when you realize why are you there, and you keep that as your focus, then you get through those challenging times.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you walk us through the timeline of making recommendations to it being implemented more wide scale on a commercial operation? You mentioned, for example, how there was only type 1 fluid available, but today for us, there's all type 4s. How does that kind of work? I know you mentioned with that Dryden accidents, you made recommendations and within a few days they were accepted. When can we see them for us as pilots today?
When I was with the safety board, we had normally the investigative phase, the field phase, as we would call it, with the fact gathering phase. That could take, depending on the severity and the extent and breadth of the accident, that could take several months. And then the writing of the factual information, and then the proposal of the analysis of that information. So you have the factual information. Now you know what happened and how it happened. And now you've got to write why it happened and the analysis. And when you write the analysis, then that should lead you to recommendations, proposed recommendations. And through the analysis, what you're identifying is contributing factors and causal factors. And once you have that, then you can write recommendations. And then the recommendations and the whole report go to the board itself. And the board then reviews that in detail and may request additional information, additional explanations, or may not accept some of the analysis you have. So it's a process. And at the end of the day, and then, of course, the interested parties who are involved in it get a chance to comment as well. And so that's why it takes that long. And even, the NTSB, for example, and some of the high-profile accidents they've had, the mid-air at Reagan, for example, last year, while you get the factual information out fairly quickly, the date, the time, the place, the who and where, now it takes a while to get through that whole analysis and recommendation phase. And that's where the pay dirt is. So it's not as fast from a pilot point of view. Looking at the industry, you're looking for change, but it's extremely important to get it right. So that takes time.
Understandable, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Throughout all the different facets in your career, was there a specific role or position that you feel really helped develop you as a person or as a leader?
I think aviation in itself and then the different responsibilities I've had in aviation have helped me develop. And I've had good mentorship. I was led by people who walked down the path before me. There are training pilots and there are check pilots. And what is the difference between a training pilot and a check pilot? Well, a check pilot, it's a pretty black and white world. You ask the pilot to do an exercise, you grade the exercise, pass, fail, or pass with a second attempt, but you don't teach and you don't assist in the pilot meeting the standard. Where a training pilot is a very rewarding role, and especially when you realize that the training pilot has a great responsibility, because it's the role of the training pilot to, first of all, set a very positive learning environment. And the secret of a good training pilot is you review the exercise, what you're going to cover in this lesson. You go through all the things, all the stages of that exercise and how it should be done. You might then, when you fly the airplane, you might demonstrate it, and then you let the pilot imitate it, the student pilot imitate it. And this is the cornerstone of a good training pilot. You not only critique what happened, but a really good training pilot then says, this is what you did wrong, but this is how you fix it. Do this to fix that error. And so the training pilots, the whole cornerstone of aviation is good training pilots, because everybody has to learn. And, one of the kind of cardinal rules in aviation is if somebody taught you how to fly, then someday you'll teach somebody else how to fly. And so I've enjoyed being a training pilot in the many roles that I was in. There's a time for checking, But training, if you make training a very positive and role for the pilot under training, they learn more as well too, and they progress better or further.
I guess it's interesting to see the difference between a check pilot and a training pilot. At the end of the day, almost anyone could adopt the role of a check pilot because it's just a list that you're following. And does this person meet these criteria? It's a pass or a fail. But to have that keen, I guess, aspect to be able to train someone, it is very rewarding, like you mentioned, in certain ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's always this aspect in aviation about giving back to the community in some way that a lot of people share. Is that kind of how you found yourself into the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum?
So the way I ended up at the museum was, and how we ended up in Ancaster and Hamilton was when I was the regional director of aircraft services. We moved out because everything had been in Toronto and was all located to Hamilton, which was a good move. But prior to that, I'd also been the regional manager of commercial and business aviation. So I was a regulator. And we had 384 certificate companies operating in Ontario at that time. And so I had a staff of 50, and we did the operational audits of those companies. So there was anything from a 705 operator to a 702 operator, 703, 704.
Yeah.
So what I realized in that position was that as a regulator, you could come in and do an audit and you could shut them down, or you could fine them, or you could punish them, or you could refer them to enforcement. But my approach was a little different. My approach was, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. Yeah, right. People won't believe that. But my thought was, as my role as a regional manager of commercial and business aviation, was that I should promote aviation within our country, within our province, within my area, which was Ontario. And I should work with industry when they're having challenges, because it's a profit-motivated business, and that's always a challenge to be able to do things safely and effectively, but also economically in a rewarding way. And so I always thought that my role was to work with industry to help them with their challenges, not just to be a roadblock or not just to say black and white. And so I found that really rewarding, where, I could work with industry, and it was it was amazing because a lot of the people we worked with, that was a new approach. They'd never seen that approach before, and it created a great positive relationship. And what would happen is, in that environment, is if a company had involuntarily not followed a regulation, they were open to self-declare rather than to try and not bring it to your attention, because they realized that we were working together. And I found that extremely rewarding. So what happened was, then I had the opportunity to go into the training role again as the regional director of aircraft services. And the CARS, the Canadian Aviation regulations, they came out in 1996. And of course, we had all these new regulations that had never existed before. And so there was a lot of catch up to do auditing of all our operators in a positive way. So the museum was a 703 operator and a 604 corporate operator. And I didn't know anybody at the museum at the time, but I was just down the hangar line from them. And the staff who had worked for me when I was a regional manager of commercial business came out to do their first audit under the Canadian Aviation regulations of the museum. And there were issues. And so in that review, my former superintendent, who was heading that audit up, asked me, he said, the guys there are asking if there's anybody who can help them. I won't mention your name unless you say it's okay. And I said, well, I'm an ex-Air Force guy. If I can help, I would like to help. And the difference was that when I was the regional manager of commercial business, I had delegated authority of the minister. So I couldn't do anything because I would have been in a conflict. But when I became the regional director of aircraft services, I didn't have delegated authority. Now I was running a 704 operation owned by the government, but I was just a 704 operator. So I then could offer to help. And so based on that audit, I came in and looked at the operations and we corrected some things that we had to correct. And that's how I got involved as a volunteer chief pilot. And when I retired from government operations, and I was going to go corporate flying, my predecessor at the museum was ready to retire.
Yeah.
And so they asked me if I might consider becoming the president and CEO.
Yeah.
And man, I was thankful I did.
Well, in that role now as president and CEO, what's kind of the mission or what's the vision of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum?
Well, we're Canada's largest flying museum. We're a non-government, not-for-profit Ontario-based charitable organization. And so we have to run it as a business because we have to pay the bills. And we have to run a flying operation, and flying airplanes that are 75 and 80 years old presents their own challenges. So my responsibility is to provide the leadership and direction and the decision-making, both not only from the museum point of view, but within the museum, we have a number of operations. And what we really want to do is we want to preserve, we want to teach, we want to educate, we want to restore, and we want to support our rich Canadian aviation, military aviation history. In a nutshell, that's what we do. And we do it in a number of different ways. So because we have to pay the bills, we have to have revenue centers. So what are our revenue centers? Well, we have a retail operation, both online and in store, which is very important. And there's a lot of specialty items that are there. We have an educational program, which is extremely active. Grade 6 within an hour and a half of the museum. Schools take buses and they spend a day on grade 6 Ontario science curriculum, theory of flight, learning about Bernoulli and learning under the wing of an airplane with a smart board with our teachers who are retired teachers, but learning aerodynamics in the museum, and the kids love it.
I would have loved that. I was there.
And we've just introduced now a drone program where they get to build a little drone and they will have a netted area and they get to fly a drone in the netted area. And then we also do grade 7 structures where they get to learn the construction and drive a rivet. And then grade 10, Canadians' history at war, the history of Canadians at war. And so when I walk in the museum on any given day during the school year, we can have 150 to 200 children in the museum. And to hear their voices, that makes the museum alive to me. I love to hear that. So that's another area. Then we also have catering and a cafe business. So we do a lot of catering for McMaster University, or we do corporate events for Royal Bank or for Hamilton Health Sciences. And we do it in the setting of the hangar. You can have a wedding and behind your head table is the Lancaster. Yeah. And people love to do that. And thank goodness. Okay. And then we also have the hard aspects of the operation, which are, we have an air maintenance organization approved by Transport Canada. We have a chief engineer, and we have a staff, and then we have a number of volunteers that work under him, under ACA authority. And our volunteers really help us because we have about 2,500 members, 2,600 members in the museum, give or take from year to year. And about 200 of them are volunteers. And by definition, we say a volunteer is a person who works maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and they bring their time and talents. And we have everything from retired surgeons to bank managers to successful businessmen to master electricians, tool makers, machinists, class 1 mechanics, and they all work and help us do the work. And I always say to them that if I had to pay minimum wage to all of you, I'd be closed at 5 tonight. And so it's a family.
Yeah.
And then we also we have to have, because we're aviation operation, we have all the SMS, both in the maintenance control manuals and the QA manuals and in the operation. We have to have all the training. So every year, all our pilots, we go through initial training, classroom training, recurrent classroom training, initial flight training, recurrent flight training. We have a plan for each pilot as to how they're going to progress, and they start small, and then depending on what opportunities arise, they can end up maybe in one day on a Lancaster, or if not, they end up on the B-25 or the PBY if they're not going to do tailwheel. So all that whole management and the planning of all that is part of my role in terms of that. And then my department heads do run their departments, and we run it like a business. We have each department has a budget. We assign a budget to each department, and we have cost centers and revenue centers. Last year we did the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Air Force, which is in 2024. We did $8.9 million in revenue, and we spent about $8 million at the expenses because we did a cross-Canada tour with the Lancaster. And then this year just ended, we did about $6.9 million. And so that keeps us viable. And now we see a really interesting development is that we see new and young Canadians, and they're coming to the museum, and it's our privilege to teach them of the history of the aviation heritage of their new country.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting to watch is the new Canadians who come, they come with all their family, the grandchildren, the grandparents, and we really welcome them and want to make them feel at home. And then, young Canadians. Now the challenge is, where I had a direct relative that was in the war. Your generation and younger generations don't have that direct connect anymore of a family member. So it's important that we find a way to pass on that connect, but we do it in a way that's entertaining as we educate them. In the museum business, we call that edutainment, and it works really well.
Yeah.
What are some challenges you face balancing education and entertainment and running a day-to-day?
We're flying World War II aircraft. So if you're an 8-year-old, maybe that doesn't have any appeal to you. But if we can come up with an immersive, interactive, digital visitor experience that hits them where they live on their phone or on their iPad, or then maybe we can tell them a story that they're looking at the technology, and the technology is attracting them. So we just opened up a new exhibit last year called Making Freedom Fly. And it's an immersive, interactive digital experience where we had took all our old film from World War II and training days, women in the RCAF in the military, and we recolorized it and digitized it. And now we have an immersive dome where we have 6 big 12-foot diameter screens, and they all have different themes. And you stand on this little circle on the rug, and it has this theme. And if you stand there, this screen comes alive with audio and visual. So that's one area. Then you come out of that, and we have meta-humans now. So what we did, with the help of the Ontario government and the Trillium Foundation, years ago, we videotaped a number of veterans who served in World War II in various roles. And we decided that we would take 6 or 7 of those stories, and we would rewrite them and edit them. We would create a meta-human in their likeness and image with their voice, because with AI, we could take a voice of a 7-year-old and now make it one of a 21-year-old. And we created 7 meta-humans. So we have a gal who worked at Victory Aircraft building Lancasters.
Yeah.
We have a pilot from Hamilton who ended up being a lawyer, a Spitfire pilot, was shot down in France, went over the Pyrenees, and was back into England. And we have a kicker from the Burma Star Squadrons. And then we have a navigator who was from Lancaster. And they told their story, but they told their story in their voice as a meta-human, and you engage them and talk to them. I think we're the first museum to do this. And if you go on our website, warplane.com, you'll actually see some of them. And so that's, you go through the gallery, we call that the gallery. Then we created a briefing room with a briefing mission board, just like it would have been World War II for Lancasters. And then we have a board where you can tap a number of topics, women, the women's division in the RCAF, heroes. You might want to talk about Bomber Command. You might want to talk about training, elementary training, the British Commonwealth, their training plant. And you can tap these vignettes, 3 of them, and you can sit down and you get a 90-second vignette on each of those. And this is all before you walk into the hangar. And then when you walk in the hangar, now we're working on being on your iPhone. You can actually look in the interior of an airplane, or you point it at the Merlin engine, and it'll give you a quick history on the Merlin engine, how many 55,000 moving parts. So we're starting to move forward in a way that will attract, entertain, but educate.
Well, I wanted to ask what excites you the most about the future of aviation heritage, but I feel like you've touched upon it, and it's so amazing to see the Warplane Museum use aspects of our evolving technology, like you mentioned, to attract the younger generation. That's exactly how we get them in and to, I guess, move this legacy forward.
I think so. And then we also, as I'm looking at a simulator in the room, we have an area called the the fly zone. And we have 6 chair simulators that the chairs move. And so you can fly anything from an F-18 to a Mosquito to a P-51, and you can attack enemy, or you can fight with each other. You can find out who the ace is.
Yeah.
And so, again, you're learning about aviation, but you're having fun in doing it. My granddaughter calls me Pop, and they call the museum Pop's Playhouse.
I was going to say, for pilots and enthusiasts, this is definitely our version of a candy shop. This is,
Really?
oh man, yeah.
Yeah, I could have never envisioned, and as a younger pilot in my career, that I'd be privileged to the extent that I have been to be able to be part of it. To carry on a tradition that Dennis Bradley started with a group of 4, and one of the 4, the second airplane we have in the collection is the Chipmunk.
Yeah.
And the registration on the Chipmunk is POW. And the reason that we have it is because our founder, who was a young man from Toronto, ended up flying Spitfires for the Royal Air Force, shot down on his 5th mission, and ended up in Stallworth 3, The Great Escape. And when he saw this Chipmunk with registration CFPOW, he bought it and gave it to the museum right away. John Weir was his name. He didn't escape because his eyes were injured in the shoot when he was shot down, but he tunneled because as a young man, he came from a well-to-do family, and his father wanted him to understand the value of the dollar. So as a teenager, he sent him up to Timmins to work in the mines for 2 summers. And so when he ended up in Stallworth 3 and they were tunneling, the tunnels were collapsing. But because of his experience in the mines in Timmins, he knew how to shore the tunnels up. And so he tunneled, and he didn't escape, but he was there, and he was part of the Great Escape. And he was one of our founding fathers. To keep that legacy and history alive is important to us. Without their foresight and vision, we wouldn't be here. And my job's easy compared to what theirs was.
And so as president and CEO now, part of your regime, I guess, is to push a lot of modernization, technology, bring more people in. Is that part of one of your goals, I'm assuming?
Yeah, one of my, it's important for our survival that we have to be, I always say to our staff, we have to be relevant in our community. So we do a lot of things that help us be relevant. Our Remembrance Day service is a very important, every day I say is Remembrance Day at the museum, but there's only one November 11th at the 11th hour. We have probably the largest indoor Remembrance Day service in the country with 2,600 people, and it's broadcast live by CHCH. And our guest speaker last November was Peter Mansbridge, whose father was Wing Commander Stanley Mansbridge, flew 58 missions in Bomber Command during World War II, including the attack on Peenemünde, the German rocket center at DFC. So we want that history to be alive, but we have to be relevant to our community. So being involved in the education is important. Being involved, in food drives and toy drives, and also companies that want to have Christmas parties, employee Christmas parties. We do a lot of those things because we want to be. The museum business is a tough business. So we've got to be more than a museum. We've got to be a center of expertise in a lot of different areas. And with the team that we have there, we are. And we will continue to do that. And, of course, flying a Lancaster, 2 in the world, 7,377 built, 2 left in the world flying. And Canada was the only country to build Lancasters outside of the United Kingdom. And we had an order of 500. And we built 430 of the 500 when the war in Europe in May 8, 1945 ended. And Victory Aircraft was a Crown Corporation set up by C.D. Howe to build them. And so we have people come from New Zealand, Australia, the UK, because it's the only Lancaster you can actually get in and touch and actually fly in. And when we take people flying, we take them over Niagara Falls, and then we go across the lake and around the CN Tower and then back. And when you think, Victory Aircraft, this is the last flying Canadian-built Lancaster. And 10,000 young Canadians built Lancasters right at the site of Pearson Airport. One a day came off the line between 43 and 45. And so to keep that history, that heritage alive, is such a privilege, And of course, when the Blue Jays were playing for the World Series, we'd go by and check the scoreboard. Is it even open? But it's just the honor to keep that whole heritage alive. And we have the PBY, the B-25, the Firefly, all the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan airplanes, the Harvard, the Jaggermoth, and the Stearman primarily. And so people can experience it. They can read about it, they can learn about it, but they can also experience what aviation was and how fast aviation developed over the years. The difference between the Lancaster, Chadwick designed the Lancaster, and 11 years later, he designed the Vulcan bomber. So then the Vulcan bomber was that huge delta-winged bomber.
Yeah.
And that's how fast aviation grew in that period of time. So it's a privilege to be part of it, and our volunteers make it real. Like all of my pilots are volunteers. They're all professional or retired professional pilots. They come and they freely give their time and talent to share this heritage with our visitors and with our members who fly in the airplane.
Why is it important to you? History, heritage, education?
There was a gentleman born in Spain who was a philosopher, poet, ended up studying at Harvard. His name was Santayana. And he was credited with the phrase, "For those who do not know history, they are condemned to repeat it." And I think, the world we're living in today is a very tense world right now with conflict. And I think that to understand what went on before, particularly in, the Great World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and that didn't happen. The Second World War was a tremendous burden on all of society. And when it ended in 45, everybody thought finally peace, but no. 5 years later, after Korea, Vietnam. And so to remember, without freedom, there could be no peace. Without peace, there can be no freedom. And to remember those values, not only just within our country, but within our humanity. If we forget that, then we will lose our way. And so we need to know what the sacrifice, the service, the duty and the sacrifice of those who have gone before us to try and provide the freedom we enjoy today. And to value that, because we may be called upon someday, or the younger generations may be called upon someday to do the same thing. And hopefully they won't be, but the world is a dangerous place right now in many ways.
I did, as we wrap up, want to go back to your experiences with the Avro Lancaster bomber. It must be such a thrill, like you already touched upon, but to be one of the handful of pilots that are still able to fly it. Could you talk to us about your 2014 tour to the United Kingdom and reuniting your Lancaster with the only other one that's in the UK right now? What did that tour feel like?
Oh, wow. What I really enjoy now is that this Lancaster right here in Ontario, right now, is the last Lancaster to fly the North Atlantic Ocean. And I remember when I checked out on the Lanc, when I took over as CEO and president in late 05, my predecessor said to me, well, if you want to fly the Lanc, you go on the Lanc. And I didn't do that. And the reason I didn't do that was because I didn't want to step in front of anybody else. I wanted to wait my turn when the opportunity came then. And so I actually did not go on the Lanc until 2012, 7 years later. And when I went on it, I flew the B-25 quite a bit. And the B-25 is a pilot's airplane. It's, made famous in the Jimmy Doolittle raid, but the airplane it's for an airplane that was designed in the early 40s to handle and perform, the balance between performance and handling, it is outstanding.
Yeah.
And so going on to the Lancaster, it's a medium bomber, but it was a fighter bomber in the Pacific because it can handle like a fighter. And so when I was going on the Lanc, I thought, well, it's a heavy bomber. It won't be won't be as agile. But I was actually very surprised. The Lancaster is actually a very good handling airplane for a heavy bomber. But when I checked out on it, I came back and Sally might ask me, well, how do you feel? And I said, well, I feel like I joined a more exclusive club than the shuttle pilots. because we only had about 8 or maybe 9 current pilots, and generally there aren't any more than that in any year. Now, going back to the trip to 2014 to the UK, a lot of the people who raised the money to restore that airplane, because this airplane's got a tremendous history. It came off the line in 45, didn't go overseas because the war was ending, went into short-term storage, was going to be re-rolled to the Taggart Force in the Pacific. Of course, in August of 45, that ended. And so it went into short-term storage again. And then the government realized that they needed maritime patrol and reconnaissance. And so then they wanted to get Lancasters to do that. And they had sold Lancasters. They had to buy them back. The Found brothers bought Lancasters, the Found aircraft. Yeah. They bought Lancasters for $1,000 a copy. And when the government realized they needed these 4-engine long-range control airplanes, the Pound brothers were very charitable. They sold them back for $10,000. So the airplane did 19 years in Greenwood in Torbay, St. John's, Newfoundland, and was retired. The reason I say this is because this airplane's got staying power. So in 1952, there was a young junior pilot flying in the Air Force. He landed hard in Trenton, and when he landed, he collapsed the right main landing gear. And the airplane was going to be written off because the center section was compromised, which is the main structure of the airplane. And there was a young technician on the airport and Trenton in the Air Force. And he knew that some pilots bought their airplanes after the war, particularly coming from farming families. And there was a family in Penhold, Alberta, that bought a Lancaster and put it on the family farm because the fuel tanks, storage, the generators and parts that they used. And in this particular case, this particular airplane ended up being a chicken coop. It was a Jenkins family farm, and the pilot was Ronnie Jenkins. And it was KB 895-434 Schooner Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force. And it was sitting there, and this young technician knew that airplane was there. So they approached the Jenkins family and asked if they could buy the center section of the airplane. And they agreed. And so that center section was put in our airplane, FM213. It carried on. It flew 19 years in the Air Force. Then it was given to the Legion in Goderich. It had flown in 14th of June, 1964, to Goderich to be retired. There was a big ceremony. And where do you think we went on the 14th of June in 2024, 60 years later? We went back to, the airplane was a gate guardian. The Legion didn't have any money, thank goodness. So they mounted the airplane on the jacking points. Didn't destroy the center section like the one in Toronto or the one in Windsor. And so, and after 11 years, it had become the biggest bird's nest in Ontario. And so the Legion really didn't have any money. And the Sully family said, we'll give you $10,000 for scholarships if you give that airplane to the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. And the museum, you can have that airplane on the condition that you restore it to flying. So it took 11 years from 77 to 88. And then it flew again in 88 for the first time.
Wow.
So the airplane's got staying power. So having said all that, I think the people who raised the money for the restoration, many of them were Bomber Command crew who came back to Canada, and they went out and they had bake sales, they had cookie sales, they had book sales. They did everything they could to raise the millions that were required to restore the airplane. And they always had a dream that airplane would go back to England. And in fact, 2 of them, when I came to the museum in 2005, came in and with handwritten plans. This is how we did it in 1942. This is how we flew the airplanes over. This is your route. This is how much it, and their dream was that airplane would go. And it was always a bridge too far. And because, the cost, how are we going to fund the cost? How are we going to make this possible? And so in 2013, the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight to fly the other Lancaster at RAF Conisbee. At the end of the year, they have an end-of-season dinner, and we're always invited to attend. We don't always make it, but in this particular year, in December 2013, we sent our chief Lancaster pilot over, and it's at the Pittwood Hotel in Woodhall Spa, which was the officers' mess of the Dambusters 617 Squadron. And it's a very, very enjoyable event. And so he's sitting next to a gentleman named Richard Lake, and Richard Lake hands Don Schofield this card, and he said, I'm not sitting here by accident. On the back of his card, he wrote, I will fund the venture for 1 month.
Wow.
Don comes back, and as soon as he gets back, he said, "Boss, I got to talk to you." So he sits down and he puts his card on my desk. And I said, you had a good dinner? He said, yeah. I said, how much did you guys drink? Because I thought, does this fellow have any idea what he's saying he's committing to? And so we decided, and this was December, so in early January, I thought, well, I better go meet this fellow and see if he's for real. Yeah. Well, he was definitely for real. He was a great supporter of the BBMF. He owned Humberside Airport, which was an airport north of Coningsby, supported all the oil rigs in the North Sea. All the helicopter support was out of this base. And he had an Hispano ME-109. He had a Mark 18 Spitfire, and he had a lot of vintage motorcycles and cars. He was the real deal. So, okay, all right, wait. So now, but we got to put a plan together.
Yeah.
How long do we go for? When do we go? What are our sources of revenue? How much will it cost? And so the flight planning and the operational side of it was one aspect. What equipment do we need? What survival equipment do we need? And Sky Demon and GPS, satellite navigation, and upgrade of, Mode S transponders and Garmin 650 and all kinds of different avionics upgrades. Well, that in itself would be about $80,000, $90,000. And then we had to make sure that in terms of the maintenance of the airplane, that we were in the right cycles on our engines, propellers, and rotables and tires, because how much would we fly? Well, just to fly over would take us 19, 20 hours. To have home would be 22 hours. And then say we're going to stay for 7 weeks, how many more hours would we fly going to air shows? Yeah. And what kind of team do we need? Because if we send 70 people volunteer to go, well, we couldn't have 70 people go because, I've got accommodations, transportation, all these things. So we ended up 20 people. The understanding was it didn't matter what your name was and what your job was. You do whatever it took with whenever needed to make the thing a success. So we put a whole plan together. At the time, my vice president, Pam Rickards, who sits retired, great lady, said, well, maybe we could sell a seat on the airplane going to England as a fundraiser. Because the fuel costs alone were going to be $450,000. Wow. Because the Canadian dollar was half of what a British pound is. So we put it out on eBay. We had a reserve of $50,000. Nobody had hit the reserve, and it's within an hour to go. And it's now early February of 2014, and within the last 30 minutes goes through the reserve. And there's a gentleman from England, Matthew Munson. He bid $82,000.
Wow.
And this is not just a ride. You were going to be trained to be a crew member. He bid 82, which was a steal. It was British parts, okay? And so he had to come over. He had to do a full ground school. He had to learn maintenance procedures, radiator, oil checks, fuel, all those things. Well, within 10 minutes of that being announced, we got a phone call from another gentleman in England. And he said, I was going to bid 100,000, but when you go through eBay, when you go through 80,000, there's a whole bunch more information required, financial substantiation, and a time close. And he said, what are you going to do? What can you do? And I said, I said, how would you like to fly back with us? So he said, yeah, okay, I'll do this. And so now we've got 182, right? And without word of a lie, 20 minutes goes another phone call from a gentleman in St. Catharines that says, I was going to bid, couldn't get past 80,000. I was trying to put my bid in and it closed. What can I do? And I looked at Pam and I said, do you think the guys would kill us if we put 2 newbies on the trip home? So he said, okay, I'll give you the 80,000. And I said, well, have you ever seen that commercial hotels.com where the 2 guys are having dinner? And the one guy paid 200 and the other guy paid 300. I said, so 80's not going to do it. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's 100. Yeah. So there was a quiet moment on the phone. All right. Yeah. So like inside of about half an hour, we had $282,000. So then we started looking at, well, what are our other revenue avenues? And we decided, well, of course, I was going to plug into the Royal Airports, the BBMF shows, wherever they were going. I would plug in and negotiate agreements and contracts with the shows. And that was very challenging because they all said, well, we don't pay for the other Lancaster. And I said, yeah, but your government owns the other one, that didn't fly across the Atlantic coach. So that was a very tedious negotiation, but it created revenue. And then finally, we decided we do member rides here. We should do UK bomber member rides there we can't do them out of the Royal Air Force Base Conisbee, but we can go to Humberside, which Mr. Lake owns, and we can do them out of there during the week when BBMF isn't flying. So we sold 90 seats. So we're starting to put a plan together now where, you know what, we can fund this, because when I went over to January to meet Richard Lake at Edward, we had dinner. I brought Leon, our chief pilot, and Don, our senior Lancaster pilot, and Jim Van Dyke, my chief engineer. And during dinner, not a word was spoken. And when he walked into the Petwood Hotel, we were all, shirt, ties, properly dressed. He's got blue jeans rolled up on the bottom, kind of field boots, a red plaid shirt with pink suspenders and flowy hair. And I'm thinking, we go live with her. And then after dinner, he said, well, I suppose you and I should talk. And I said, I think we probably should. So we went into the bar and we had a glass of wine. And the first thing he said to me was, well, now, Dave, I really don't want to spend any of my own money. And I thought, oh, no. So I chimed his glass with mine and I said, well, Richard, and I don't want to spend any of mine. So that's how we started. But I said, when I come back, I'll see if we can put a plan together that makes it happen. And it turned out so the whole trip, we did all this, and then we had to sell it to the board. There was a risk. And as it turned out, the whole trip cost us $1.2 million. And we had on our financial planning between retail sales, appearances, air shows, and basically our member rights. And then we had another gentleman who wanted to pay to fly on our wing with photographers when we were doing the member rights. So once we realized that he was professional and he met our standards, then we could do that. At the end of the day, we decided 7 weeks, and they wanted us there on August the 8th. And then we stayed till the end of September. We wanted to be out the North Line coming home by the end of September. Cost $1.2 million, and we predicted we would come home with $300,000 net. We came home with $1.2 million. That's how big it was. That was unbelievable. And Sully was there when the airplane arrived at the RAF Conisbee to the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. And what just touched everybody's heart was they had as many Bomber Command veterans as they could have there. And they were all recognized and given a class. They never got a medal. They should have got a medal. And there were tears flowing everywhere. And see, the first Canadian Lancaster came off the line, KB 700, in August of 43, and they flew over to England to serve and fight. The last flying Canadian Lancaster came off the line in 45 and flew to England in August of 2014 to serve and remember. And that's what it was.
Yeah.
That's what it was all about.
It's phenomenal that you guys were able to pull that together.
And it was such a privilege to be part of it. And
so incredible.
It was, but I must tell you, it did have its challenges. We lost an engine at Humberside, and it was on a Friday, and Thwaites Brewery, who made Lancaster beer in the UK, had helped us with a $175,000 donation. And so at Middleton St. George, or Durham Tees, is where 419 Squadron was based, which is where Andrew Minarski was part of 419 Squadron. And so we were at 419 Squadron, where there's a statue of Andrew Minarski, and we had executives from Thwaites Brewery, and we were doing the rides that we'd promised them that we would do with them. And then it was Friday morning on the 31st of August. After that was done, then they were taking off to Bournemouth for the air show on the weekend, and Bournemouth was the largest air show in the UK that year. And on final, all of a sudden, the white smoke started trailing off number 4 engine, and there was a Lancaster veteran standing beside some of our guys, and he said, "Oh, they lost the supercharger." You know exactly what happened. So we landed, but we wrote the engine off. So now, on the Wednesday falling, so we're north of Conisbee, And on the Wednesday coming up, we have what we call the 2 lengths dinner, and it was a benevolent dinner for the RAF. And the RAF couldn't fund any funding in advance to set up the dinner. So they asked us if we could loan them £25,000 so that they could organize the dinner. And then based on the proceeds from the benevolent dinner, they would pay us back. So we had all that in place. So on the Wednesday in Coningsby, this was going to be a huge event. And now we're in Durham Keys or Middleton St. George with no engine. And this is on Friday. So I had to sign a deal with the Royal Air Force called Power by the Hour. And we got one of their Rolls-Royce 500 engines, and ours are Packard Merlin 224s built by Packard Motor Company in Detroit. So a little different configuration rigging. So our guys, we had no tools, we had no equipment. All the tradesmen from Durham Keys came in with forklifts and tools, and they gave our guys everything. And then all the restaurateurs came in with food. You guys were working here's some food, and they we got our engine dropped, and we got the other engine from Retro Track and Air that does all the RAF engines, and we got it on and mounted, and we flew it out of Durham Keys on Tuesday, back to Coningsby to make the 2 lengths dinner.
Wow.
And the officer commanding our RAF Coningsby came up to me that night, and he said, I don't know, we could have done that. So, I mean, it was a great brotherhood, camaraderie. It was just a wonderful experience. And it was all to recognize Bomber Command. And I think probably the best way to end this maybe is to realize that, if you were in Bomber Command, a crew member in Bomber Command, didn't matter what station you might have been in, you had to do 30 operations to finish your tour. Your chances of surviving those, not being shot down and injured, taken prisoner of war, your chances of coming home, your best odds were 40%. It could be lower, depending on where you were, between 39 and 45, but the best odds you ever would have had was 40%. And so of that 120,000 plus that served, a third were allies. And so you had the Kiwis, you had the Aussies and Canadians, some Polish, and 55,573 didn't come home. And of that, 10,695 were young Canadians. And so when you look at that sacrifice, that service, that duty, and that sacrifice, and the odds that they were the ones that were taking the fight to the enemy. I mean, the Battle of Britain, Churchill said, never was so much owed to so few, but the path to victory was the bombers. And it was at a high price. And so to be able to commemorate that sacrifice, that duty, and that's why it was so big there, because their land was under siege and they were under threat of attack. And Bomber Command, you don't criticize Bomber Command over there. And everywhere we went, there were 10 and 15 deep at the fences, all the Canadians. And if we went into town, on the church steeples, the Canadian flags and the laundromat, you'd walk into a restaurant, you could not buy anything. If you walked into a pub, you couldn't buy a pint of ale. All the Canadians, and it was a tremendous experience that probably, will never happen again, but it did happen.
Yeah.
And it happened for the right reasons, to serve and remember.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful that it did end up happening and that we were able to get that piece of history over and to commemorate. And God bless Pam for her incredible idea. That was such a good one. That's amazing. That's really amazing.
And we do have a documentary called Reunion of Giants that we made.
Yeah, please pass that along. We'll share it around. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dave. I think, for one, you have such a powerful message that I think a lot of our listeners will understand more through your experiences, through your stories. You do a lot for the aviation community with the Warplane Heritage Museum, and even just talking to you today, I can still see that you're still very excited about what you do and looking forward ahead into the future. So
I sit here at this point in my career and I look at the youth and the torches being passed, and I'm proud that we're passing it to such a capable and talented generation. So where you will go and what you will do will far exceed what we've done.
Well, we only hope to carry that legacy, and we hope that with our conversations today, we inspire other aviators to help out where they can with the Heritage Museum. We'll definitely share through our social media the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum to inspire those to get involved, whether that be through volunteering or even just taking their family down to check it out. I'm sure it'll benefit everyone. And with that said, thank you again for joining us today, and to our listeners for tuning in to episode 14 of the Blue Skies podcast. We wish all of you blue skies and tailwinds ahead. We'll catch you next time.